Okay, hello everybody and good evening and welcome to tonight's live webinar. So tonight the live webinar is going to be on Excel VBA arrays. Now if you can just hear me, if you can just let me know where you're from, just so that I know that my sound and everything is working okay. Which I think it pretty much looks good from here, but just to be 100% sure. And I'll just get started in about 4 minutes. So we'll just start right on top of the hour, just to give everybody a chance to start. So what I'm going to cover tonight is basically just all to do with arrays and VBA. So I've written a blog post on VBA before and it's been very popular. And so what I'm going to do is just cover the different areas of arrays. So you can focus on that particular blog post for more details and, you know, as a reference guide. And when I start the webinar, I'll just show you, I'll give you the URL for that actual blog post, and I'll just show you how you can locate it. So let me just check. I'll just do some last minute checks now just to make sure everything is okay, but I think I'm good. Okay, great stuff. The video is good and voice is loud and clear. Yeah, thanks very much. Hope you're keeping well. So as I said, I'm just waiting for the last just few people to turn up, because a lot of people will kind of arrive just for 8 o'clock. So just to give everybody a chance. So in Ireland here, it's currently 8 p.m. at the moment. So maybe afternoon if you're in the States, and if you're towards the east, it may be later at night. So this is the blog post that this kind of webinar is based on. So this has the guide to everything to do with arrays, and it's quite good for reference, particularly if you look at the quick guide at the start. So if you want to just reference something quickly about arrays, it's quite good. And if you want to get more detail, then you can go down into it. But sometimes when you haven't used arrays in a while, you just want to go back and just get a quick reference to them. So it's quite useful for this. Hi Eric, how are you doing? So just 1 more minute and then we can kick it off. So let me just move that over here. I'll just mention that again, just for anyone that just wasn't here while I was doing it. So I'll just count down to the last few seconds and then we can get started. Okay, so it's 8 o'clock. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and kick it off. So everybody, welcome tonight. So what I'm covering is Excel VBA arrays, a complete guide. So first of all, let me just go through who am I basically, because you may not know my website or what I'm about. So I own the VBA website Excel Macro Mastery. So it's excelmacromastery.com, and I started this back in December 2014. So it basically covers in-depth articles about the important areas of Excel VBA. And what's different about these articles is that they're quite in-depth. So they're kind of probably around 4,000 words per article, just on average. And my idea is always to have kind of lots of code and lots of practical code that you can use in your own applications, and to have kind of an in-depth guide about, say, arrays or loops or collections. Excuse me. So what tends to happen in a lot of articles in programming is that you just get kind of bite-sized chunks, and it doesn't really give you enough information if you're trying to use it in a practical application. So I was trying to kind of get around that and just give like proper articles that you can really use. So I've been writing software professionally for over 20 years. So originally I started writing C++, SQL Server, always did a bit of kind of Visual Basic. And then as the years went on, I did more kind of C#, ASP.NET, that kind of thing. And in the last number of years, I've been very heavily focused on VBA. And I've done, not just in programming, but I've done quite a lot of training in VBA as well. And I am based in Ireland. So this is my website, so excelmacromastery.com. And if you just go to the main page, this is what you'll see. You just get a menu of all the articles. And so the article today is the one on the bottom there. It's the complete guide to using arrays. So I'll just bring up that actual article here so that you can actually see it. So, hi Sanders, yeah, you're at 5 AM in Australia. Yeah, quite early. Yeah, glad you can hear me. So if I just bring up, so this is the web article, and it's quite good for reference. So at the start, we have like a table of contents here where you can see whatever the different areas of arrays, but you can actually read through this article and it builds it up from a very basic level into everything that you need. And also what we have at the start is a quick guide. So if you just want to reference something with arrays, just want to come back quickly, you can see it all here. And so I'm going to work through these arrays this evening, and I'm going to do it with live code. So it's not like a presentation, it'll be actual live code that I'm doing. So let me just move to the next slide. So just for the video quality, just sometimes this kind of arises with people that are new. If you want to get the best quality, just use the setting on YouTube. So click on the wheel at the bottom that you see there in red, select the quality, and then select the quality to be 1080. Now if you have that on if you can manage that, if your connection is good enough, the quality of Excel should be almost as good as if you're looking at Excel on your PC. So the quality should be quite high. If throughout the presentation difficulties on a browser, sometimes either press F5 to refresh, and if that doesn't work, then try a different browser. That kind of solves the problem a lot. And hopefully there won't be a problem at my end, because then nobody will hear. So that's arrays. So let's get down to actually writing some code. Arrays. So first of all, the first thing that we kind of start off with when we're dealing in Visual Basic is what we call variables. So variables are quite a simple kind of concept, and the idea of a variable is that we store a value in memory, and it's just a temporary value, but we need temporary values when our application is running. Now why it's quite useful is that we don't have to worry about where we store it in memory or how it's stored or anything like that. VBA looks after this for us. We just have to create it like we do with the dim statement, and then we can place a value in it. So we place a value in it. For example, if we do something like this. So if we take our numbers worksheet here, so we have some random numbers. So what we're going to do is just write a value off that worksheet into our variable. So we just write from range A1. So I mean, it's quite simple really. And then the next thing we do with a variable is we just basically read from it. So we're always we either create a variable, we place something in the variable, and we read from the variable. So these are the three things that we do. So let's run this. Now first of all, we'll bring up the immediate window so we can see the result. And when we select run macro, and it prints out 43. So it basically just read the value into the variable and printed it out. So far so good. So let me hide this locals window. So now imagine that we're looking here, and imagine someone says, okay, that's very good, but now we want to read 2 marks. So what we would do is we would create a second variable. And so now we have mark 1, we've got mark 2, and of course we're going to read them also. So mark 1, mark 2, then we write out the values. So again, this is very simple stuff that we're looking at the moment. So we run this code and you can see it printed out 43 and it printed out 13. Now imagine, as would happen in a real world application, that someone says, well, what about if we have 10 students, or what about if we have 100 students? And obviously if we write one, if we like create one variable per student, we're going to have like 300 lines. So we need one to create it, one to read the value, and one to write the value. So this obviously wouldn't be feasible, because potentially we could have data that has maybe 10,000 items or 100,000 items. Now the second drawback of using variables, say for multiple items, is that it doesn't give us a lot of flexibility. So if we're reading worksheets, for example, the first one may have 10 students, the second one may have 50 students, the third one may have 75. So we want our code to be flexible to deal with these numbers. And it's for these two reasons that we actually use arrays. So the arrays are quite powerful, and it can make it much easier in our code to deal with lots of common values. So let's look at the above code and how we would do it as an array. So what we would do is we do mark122 as long. So this is how we create an array. And then the value in it, we're actually going to keep this the same the first time we run it, just to show you the similarities. So when we want to reference an item, we basically just use the number. So we use mark1 or mark2, and this gives us the position in the array. So mark1 and mark2. So if you look at the code, it's very similar to the above, but the difference is that we just have one item to declare. So that's our array. And we'll just run this code again. So I'm going to delete what's in the immediate window. So we run this code, and it asks us to run arrays. So we'll just run this arrays, and we get 43 and 13. So it basically works the same as we would expect. Now, obviously, we want some way of changing how we read. So we're reading the values in here, but obviously if we have 100 marks, we don't want to have 100 lines. So this is where we use for loops. So for loops allow us to kind of utilize the power of arrays. So instead of having to have a line for each one, we can use a for loop to make our life easier. So we create a for loop like this. We just basically say for I equals 1, 2, 2. And then we place our item in it, and then we have the next. So just in case you're not familiar with for loops, what basically happens is the line between for and next gets repeated, and it gets repeated the number of times we specify. So when we say 1 to 2, what happens is the first time it does the line I is equal to 1, the next time I is equal to 2. And if it was I to 10, it would be the same idea, that it would do it 10 times and I is equal to a different value each time. And so what we do is we place mark here as I, and we use I as the row number as well in this case. And we can also use the for loop to print out the value as well. So we use a second for loop to print out the value. So let's debug compile. So this makes sure we have no errors in our code, and then we run the code, and you can see it printed out 43, 43. So the reason that's incorrect is because this is 1. And so what we want to do is make sure that it's I. So let's delete this and run it again. And you can see that the value that we have is 43 and 13. So it works the same. Now, so far it's not that different than what we have in the basics. But if someone comes along and says, okay, I want to, let's just make it 20. I want to read 20 values. So they want to read 20 values. All we've got to do is we've got to set the 20 values like this. And then when we run the code again, our code will read the 20 values. So if we look in our sheet, you'll see that the last value was 20. The 19th value is 66, and so on. So this is the big advantage of the array here. So if we wanted to go to 1,000, we would just change 1,000. So this has saved us on our lines of code. Now, one thing that we want to keep in mind is, well, I'll actually leave it until I get onto the next, until I get onto what we call dynamic array. So what we're talking about now is flexibility. So let's take this again, and I'll just push it down. So the array that we've been looking at so far is what we call a static array. And the reason that it's static is we said mark 1 to 20. Now what this means is that every time that we run our application, this array is going to have 20 slots in it. So that's what we mean by static. We've got no flexibility. So what we can use instead is a dynamic array. So let me just show you exactly in memory how the array looks. So I'm putting a breakpoint here. So when I run the code, it will pause at the breakpoint. And when it pauses at the breakpoint, we can view the locals window or the watch window, whichever we prefer. And we can look in mark, and you can see that in this case, let's just bring it up here, that there's 20 slots. So this is what it looks like in memory. So there's 20 slots. Now I'm just stepping through the code here. So as I step through the code, it places the value 43 in the first one. Now it goes to the next one. So I in this case is now 2. It's quite small the way it does it in VBA. So I is 2 at this point, and if we step to the next line, it sets mark 2 to be 13, and the next one it sets the value, and so on. So that's how the array looks like in memory. So as I said, in this particular case, the array is fixed because it's always going to be 20. Now in the real world, it's very unlikely that you're going to have a fixed set of data that you're going to read from. And even if you do have a fixed set of data, what you tend to want to do is to make your code flexible in case someone comes along and says, okay, today I've just got a bit more data, or something changes, which will normally happen. So what we do instead is we normally create a dynamic array. Now dynamic is just the same, except when we declare it, we don't specify the size. We're basically saying to VBA, we'll let you know in the future. We're going to create an array of this type, and in the future we'll let you know what the dimensions are. Now how we set the dimensions is using redim, and we set the dimensions, it's very similar to how we use dim, in fact. So that's how. Now if we run this code, it's going to be the same as the static, but the difference with redim is that we can actually set a variable here. So because it's at runtime, we can use the code to check the number of students, and then we can use this as a variable. Now we can also put the redim in if statements and stuff like that. So this gives us some flexibility. So what we can do is, for example, we can say last row, and we say we want to get the last row, and we get the last row of numbers. So dim last row equals, and so in this one it'll be sheet names. So this is just sheet numbers. Sorry. So this is just the standard way that we get the last value. So we get a, and we do ampersand, and then we do sheet numbers, and so numbers that should be, and then rows and count. So this is basically getting us the last cell, and then we use end XL up. It's like basically pressing control up, and this will give us the last cell in a value, or sorry, the last cell with a value in this column, and then we just want the row of that cell. And then once we have that, we can use last row everywhere. And this should print out all the numbers that we have. So this should print out every number here, and we have 100 numbers. So the last numbers we should get should be 94, 16, 55 when we run this code. So let me get rid of this. So debug compile, always very useful to use, because what it does is checks for errors throughout your code. And then we run. And let me open up this, and let me just clear this. And I will get rid of the locals window, and let me just run this again. Now it didn't look right to me there, but maybe I was wrong. So 94, 16, 55, and the last values, yeah, 94, 16, 55. So that read everything. So what it actually did there was it found the last row, then it used this in the array. Now if we use a static array, we can't use this. We have to go with a fixed one every time. So that's why the dynamic is much more useful. So that's dynamic. So that's the dynamic array. So one thing just to keep in mind here is when we come down to here, so normally we create the array, we fill the array, and then we write it out somewhere. So that's in very basic terms. Now this line here, the problem is that the array could change somewhere along the line. So we could redim this array again somewhere in the code. Now the code wouldn't be all together like it is here. So someone could say, let's just add a couple of extra slots to it and make it bigger. And our code here now won't work because it doesn't know that the array has changed. So we can use these L bound and U bound, which is basically the lower bound to the upper bound. And what it simply means is that it gets the lower bound of the array. So in this case, the lower bound is 1. It gets the upper bound. So our upper bound, now we've added 10 here, would be 30. And it basically will read through it. So why this is useful is that it basically looks at the array, figures out the size of it, and then we use that size in our for loop. So this saves us worrying about if the array has changed or trying to calculate or trying to store it in a variable. We can just check the array when it arrives. So this will work with any one-dimensional array. And when we look at two-dimensional arrays, it will actually work with those as well once we have the two-dimensional array code. So let's run, if we'll clear out our immediate window, and if we run our code again, you can see that it ran just as well when we put this in. So that is basically the difference between kind of dynamic and static arrays. So one thing just to keep in mind when we're dealing with arrays is, let me just take this one actually. So what we get sometime, we get this error, and you'll see it a lot in VBA, and it's one of the easier errors because it basically means the same thing everywhere, where some errors can have a lot of causes. This is one. So if we create an array with 20 parts to it, so if we say mark 1 for example equals 55, so that's no problem at all. But if we try to access a value that doesn't exist, so 21 for example, we get the subscript out of range error that we got here. So let's run this again. Subscript out of range. So let me do a debug compile. Yeah. So we're getting that error on this line here. So I'm going to just run it to this line. And when we step past this line, we get the error subscript out of range. Now the reason that happens, as I said, is because what we have, the numbers that we have here are what we call indexes. So it's the index to the array, or the more common name or the proper name is the subscript. So when it says subscript is out of range, it's basically saying subscript isn't between 1 and 20 of our array. So the subscript is incorrect. So anytime you see subscript out of range, that's what it means. And this is the same if we use something like a worksheets collection and we say sheet 10. Say there's only 3 worksheets in our current workbook. If we say worksheets 10, so let me just give an example of where it works and where it doesn't work. So debug print this. So if we run this, it gives us the subscript out of range because we don't have 10. But if we run it with 1, it works fine. It printed out the worksheet as numbers. But if we put 10, it gives us the subscript out of range. So anytime you see this, it essentially means you have a collection and you're trying to access a place in the collection that doesn't exist. So just something to be aware of. So that is essentially just the basic introduction to arrays. So the next thing that we'll get onto is kind of why we use arrays. So arrays are very much used with ranges in VBA. So what we want to have a look at then is two-dimensional arrays, because these are typically the ones that you will kind of deal with most of the time. So let's just first of all have a look at what two-dimensional is. So one-dimensional essentially is like one line like this. So it's basically like one column of items. And two-dimensional is basically rows and columns. So it's multiple columns. So essentially a worksheet is a two-dimensional, is basically the same as a two-dimensional array. It's just a list of rows and columns. It's a grid of rows and columns. And that's essentially what a two-dimensional array is. Whereas a one-dimensional array is just a list like this. So how we use a two-dimensional array is we basically, it's very similar to one-dimensional. We just add the dimensions like this, so 1 to 5 as long. And that creates our array. And then when we want to place something in the array, I mean, it's quite similar. We just use the first and second values. So marks 1, for example, equals say 67, and marks say 2.5 equals and so on and so forth. So I'll run this again and we can look at it in the locals window, and this will kind of show us exactly kind of what we're looking at. So let me close the immediate window. So this is the mark. So if we open the marks, you can see it's got 3 parts, and then if we open either of those parts, they've got 5 parts. So in other words, it's basically a row. It's basically each marks is a row, and each row has a number of columns. So you can see 67 was written here. You can see that 75 is written at position 25, and you can see that the rest is just all zeros. So how we print out the actual, let me just come down here with this. So how we print out the actual array is very similar to how we did the original one. So what we use again is the for loop. So we use dim, so we just declare I as a long, and we say for I equals L bound, so that's marks, to U bound marks, and of course we put our next at the end. Now when we did this before, okay, we used it like this and this is fine, but actually the correct way to use it is like this. This basically says the dimension. Now this is the default, so we don't need to use it. We could just like leave it blank and it's the same as this. But I'm going to leave it here because when we use the second dimension, it makes it clear. So we're saying let's go through each row, and for each row let's go through each column of that row, so each item in that row. And in this case we use 2 here because it's the second dimension, and again we use next j. Now when we want to print out the item, it's actually quite easy. We just use marks and we just use I comma j. That's all that we have to do. So I'm just going to print out I and j before that so that we can just see exactly the values. And if we go to the immediate window, and I'm going to clear it out here, and let's move it up here. Okay, let me just undock it again. And so when we run the code here, you'll see that it prints out. So it prints out the ij. So 1, 1 has value 67, 1, 2 has value 0, 1, 3, and so on and so forth. So normally when we're dealing with a, so let me just hide this immediate window. So normally when we're dealing with ranges, we want to be able to place values into an array, and the array that it places values into is a two-dimensional array because a worksheet itself is two-dimensional. So let's use ranges. So let's take a look at the range here. So the range that we have here is A2 to D11. So if we wanted to place these values in an array, we can actually do it really simply, and this is one of the real beauties of using Excel VBA and of using arrays with it. We declare our array as a variant. So what a variant means is that we're not deciding just yet what our type of variable we're going to use. We're going to decide it when our application runs. Now, it's not always good to use a variant, but sometimes like this, you have to use a variant in VBA. So we say array equals, and then we just basically get the data that's there. So this is the sheet marks. So sheet marks range, and we go from A2 to D11 and the value. And what this does is this will automatically create a two-dimensional array and place all the values in it. And so if we run the code, and then we'll just take a look in our locals window. And you can see that we have 10 items because there was 10 rows, and you can see that each item has 4 rows, and you can see it has the correct values. So if we look here, you can see the values in the first row are 53, 63, 10 and 97. So, and if we go down through them all, you'll know that they're correct as well. So this is the really useful part of VBA, that we can do that. Now, what we can also do is we can also do the opposite. So we can also place the values in a particular range back. So I'm just going to move this range. So I use offset. So offset will move across no rows and 4 columns. So offset is just moving the range across 4, and I'm just going to set that range to equal array. Now when we run this code, so we run the code from here, and you can see that it just wrote out the values here. Actually, let me just offset it by 6. So I'm going to move it across another 2, and then I run it, and you can see that it printed out the same values. So we can read the values and we can write the values back. Now, one thing that I should point out is very important to keep in mind is that when we use this line here, so when we place a range of values in an array, it's actually creating a copy of the values. So if we change the values in the array, it will not change the original values. If we want to change the original values, we have to write the values back. So this is very important to keep in mind. So let's try a little experiment where we'll actually go ahead and do this. So what we're going to do is we are going to, now I should have this as long. I didn't have option explicit, that's why I didn't complain. So option explicit means you have to declare a variable. So I didn't declare J here, and it didn't complain. So variable not defined is marks, and that's because, yeah. So I just replaced marks with array in this procedure, and we're up and running again. So what we're doing here is we're reading the values and we're writing the values back. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to just multiply each value by 10. So you can see the difference that we have. So we read the values in. We read the values into the array. Then we read through the array and we multiply each value by 10. And then we write the values back like so. So let's run this code. Let me just make sure. Let me run this code here, and variable not defined. Oh yeah, it's my search and replace. I should have done a whole world. It actually researched. It actually replaced these. It actually replaced marks in this actual variable name. So let me go again, and I did it down here also. And you can see, so it ran this time, and you can see that it multiplied all the numbers. Now, what we want to keep in mind here is that the original values weren't changed. We copied those to the array. We made a change in the array. Doesn't affect the original value because it's just a copy that we have. And then we write out the values back here. So that's the good news about ranges, okay? So it's quick to read, quick to write. It's actually quicker to process. If you're dealing with something like 100,000 values, it's actually quicker to process the values in an array because it's in memory. If you access the values through the spreadsheet, it'll be much slower. So if you're dealing with a lot of data, it's a great idea to put the values into an array first. Now, the disadvantages of this is that it's rare in an application that you'll actually just get to read a value out like we did and just write the value back to the exact same size range. And in VBA with these arrays, it's actually very difficult. If, for example, you want to read through the values and say, for example, you just want to take certain rows, there's no easy way of copying those rows from the array. So that's why it's different. So the arrays are quite rigid once you create them, and to resize them and to do different things like this is not easy. So you kind of get a lot of really good stuff for free, but then if you want to do stuff like just take certain rows from the array, it's actually can be quite difficult to do it. So that's just something just to be aware of with arrays. Now there's one more little thing that might catch you out here, so let me just copy this down. It's just one tricky little thing. If you read a range, and the range that you read is, for example, just one value, so we'll just say one value, and we'll put our breakpoint here, and let's run what we have here. So if the item you deal with is one value, it isn't an array, it's actually a variant or a double. So if you just read one range into an array, into what you expect to be an array, VBA won't create an array. So you've got to be very careful here. So if this happens, now most of the time you're going to read, this won't be the case, but if it happens that there's only one item, you need to write code to deal with that. So you have to say, if range only contains one cell, then I want to do this, otherwise I want to create an array. So just something to be aware of. Okay, so the next thing that I wanted to look at is just data reading. So what I mean by that, just kind of a small example of kind of an actual application, just a simple application. So let's take this. So these are just random made up names that I have. And it's just a list of people with first names, last names, the city they're from, and the country. So we're just going to do a random application. And in this application, what we want to do is we want to write out the country of all the people who have 4 letters in their name. So anyone with 4 letters in their name, we want to write out the country, and we're going to write that to column G. So it's quite a simple little application. So the first thing that we want to do basically is we want to place all the values in our array. So we'll imagine we have so many. We say, let's place them in an array because an array is much faster to read. So let's do the name reader. We'll call this the name reader. So we can use our current region to actually do this. So array as variant. So we've created our array, and so the sheet is sheet names. Is this sheet names or sheet people? It's actually sheet people. So sheet people dot range, and we want A1, and we want the current region. Now if you're not familiar with the current region, if we use the current region in an array, it basically gives us back all the data beside it. So it gives us back the rectangular data beside that data. It uses kind of the blank columns as kind of a border. But in this case, it will give us back all the data on the worksheet because it's all adjacent. So basically, current region gives us back all adjacent data as the range. And what we want of this adjacent, we want to get value because we want to place that in our array. So basically, we're just putting this range of data into our array. And then, of course, we want to read through our array. But we're not going to read through the array like a two-dimensional one because we're only checking the first item. So we can just use I equals, and we'll just use L bound array to U bound array. So this reads through our array, and that ends our array. And so what we want to do now is we want to check the name. So we basically do it like this. We do array I. So I is the first item, and it's 1. So it's the first. I is the current item, and 1 is the item in the first position. So if the length of this is equal to 4, if the length is equal to 4, then we want to write out the value. So we want to write the value 2, and we want it to be, we'll say G. So we want to write out here. So let's write out countries here. And we want it to be G. I want it to be G1, but we want to offset it by the current row. So whatever's at that position, we want it to equal to array I and 4. So the reason it's 4 is because it's the country. So looking back here, I1 is the first name, I2 would be the surname, I3 is the city, and I4 is the country. And we want to write that out. Now what row is just a simple long variable. So row as long, and we set the variable to 2. And then every time we write out something, we just want to add 1 to row so that it moves to the next cell. So first thing we always do is debug compile, make sure we don't have any errors. And then what we do next is we just put a breakpoint on here. So when we run our code, we run the code, and what happens is we stop on the line here. Now the first item, I'm just going to show you the data at the same time. The first item has 5. So let me just move this down. So the first item has 5. So it will just kind of skip past this. So the next time I now equals to 2. Actually, yeah, I now equals to 2. So it skips it as well because we've included the header. That's why. So it's when I equals 3. So I equals 3 now because we're on Zeus. And so it's going to write out the name. So it writes out what's in array I4. And what's in array I4 is Tunisia. So let us look at this. So I is currently 3. And we can see Zeus is 3.1 and Tunisia is 3.4. So we'll write out that value to our cell G2. And it wrote it out. Actually, we should have started offset row. We should have set row to 1 because it's not starting at 2. It's counting at 2. So let's just stop this and let's just delete this and just run it again. And then when it steps through this, now I'll put a breakpoint actually in here so it'll just go straight to here. It writes it out to Tunisia. So the next time we get a value, it will write the next value, the Virgin Islands, which is where Nola is from, and it adds and so on. And then we run and it just does all the names just like that. So you can see that it's quite useful. The array would be much faster than if you're reading through the actual range itself. Now, as I said, the disadvantage is that if you had a lot of data there and what you just wanted to do, you wanted to take the rows. So imagine your row has 100 pieces of data. If you just wanted to copy the rows that matched our criteria, then it's not easy to do that in an array. There's no easy way of just taking that row from the array and putting it somewhere else. You kind of have to put the lines of code to manually copy it. So you need to use some kind of for loop. So just that's just something that it's good to be aware of. So this basically is the basics of using the array. So let me just go through what we've kind of covered with using the array. So let me just bring this up properly. So the reason we use the arrays is that they help us to reduce the code. So in other words, we don't need to create a variable for each array marks or anything like that. We can just use an array, and the array is flexible, so each time we can decide how many that we need, so how many slots that we need. In other words, like what we're really doing is we're saying to VBA, our VBA is allowing us to decide at runtime how many variables we want. So we can create a static as our dynamic. So again, static is when you say the size at the start, so you might say it's 1 to 20. Now it's rare in the real world that you'll use static. Normally it's going to always be dynamic because you're always going to deal with dynamic data, except in very kind of unless you're kind of in you know, unless maybe you have just a simple project. So sorry Guy, you're asking, yeah, sorry. So the SH people and SH names, the code names. So you're asking what are SH people and SH names, the worksheet code names. And yeah, they're the code name of the worksheet. So let me go back and I'll just explain exactly what they are. So if we look here on the VBA project window, you can see that we have 2 names for our worksheets. So the name in the parentheses on the right hand side is the actual worksheet name. So this is the name that you see on the actual worksheet tab. Now the name in the left is what we call the code name. Now normally when you open a new workbook, they'll both be sheet 1 and sheet 2 and so on. Now what we can do with the code name, what I've been doing, is that you can actually directly access the item. So you can just use sheet marks to directly access the worksheet. So you don't need to go to the worksheets collection or anything like that. Now the big advantage of the code name is that if the user changes, so if we look at the properties here, the code name can only be changed here. So if the user changes the worksheet name, it won't affect us. Our code will still work fine. So this is why we use the code name. It's quite useful. Now the one drawback is that we can only use the code name when the worksheet is in the same workbook as the code. So if our worksheet is in a different workbook, then we can't use the code name. So just to get back then to what I was saying with arrays, and yeah, so I was just saying to help us reduce code, they are flexible. We can create dynamic or static, so they can have more than one dimension. So we saw if we're doing like lists, we kind of one dimension, but when we're dealing with ranges and items like this, we're going to have 2 dimensions. So when we read from a range, it's going to create automatically a 2-dimensional array. So it's important to understand. Now you can have, so I'll just get to those questions in a second. So we can have more than one dimension and 2 dimensions, but we can actually have 3 dimensions and more if we want. But I mean, there's never really been a case that I've needed to have 3 dimensions. Now I'm sure in particular kind of applications that it may occur, but if you're using a 3rd dimension, it's worth kind of really thinking about what you're doing and do you really need to use it, because it can make your code a lot more complicated, and a lot of the time you may be on the wrong track. So as I said, it's the reason range is very quickly is because, or very useful, it can read directly from the range and vice versa. It's very fast. If we take it from the range, read through the array, it's much quicker to do this than it is to go through the actual worksheet itself. So is option based used? Yeah, so Christopher, you're asking, is option base 1 used with these examples? So I haven't used any option base, but yeah, what option base does is it gives the default of the array. So the array can start at 0 or the array can start at 1. So for example, so let me just give an example of this. So if we let me see. So let's just do an option example. So if we create an array like this, and let's run the code to the end and let's just have a look. So by default we use option base 0. So this actually creates an array the same as if we had said 0 to 1. So if we don't specify it, it creates this by default. Now if we go to the top and we say option base 1, and then we do this, and so let's run our code again. Now if we look in the array this time, you can see that it started at 1. So having option base 1 is the same as this, would give us the same result as this. So option based 1, if we don't specify the base, it actually gives us the base as 1. If we use option base 0, or we don't use an option base, then the default is 0. So I hope, Christopher, that makes sense, or Christoph, sorry, Christoph. So Mark, you're saying if you had a blank null cell in the range and made an array, would that item be set to 0 or null? I'm thinking if in your marks there was a pupil who missed the tests. If it's blank, as far as I know, it will be set to 0. But I mean, let's just, yeah, hold on, I'll leave that code there actually. But I mean, let's just test it out. If it's blank, it's set to 0 anyway, as far as I know. So just test blank, we'll say. So we'll have a look at the numbers here. So let's just do, so we'll make the second one blank. So let me just push this down. So make a second one blank. So we'll just do, say, dim array as variance, and then we'll say array equals and sheet numbers dot range, and we'll say A1 to A4. And of course we better leave in the value. So I'll just run the code to here. So if we check the array here, so we have 1 1 is 43, so 1 2 is, it's just empty actually. So it didn't actually place any value in it, so it actually places it as empty. So yeah, so normally though, yeah, if a student missed a test, it's tricky. It's things like that that get tricky when you're programming. So you basically have to kind of come up with what you want to do. If the basically what you're doing with your application. So are they writing out something? So if you're writing a report, say, and somebody missed, you probably in your report want to have text in it rather than a value. So yeah, you may want to convert at some point. You might want to convert the numbers into text, and then convert that particular value into text. Or yeah, it depends on the application, but that's kind of tricky. You have to kind of go through and say, okay, this one is empty, so they didn't sit the test. Yeah. So Mashek, you're saying, can we have constants table? Can we have like arrays with constant values? As far as I know, we can't have constant arrays. As far as I know, like there's a kind of a workaround that you can do with them, but generally speaking, you can't have just a constant array. Someone asked me that before, and there was like a kind of a good answer on that that was on Stack Overflow, but it's kind of like it's a workaround, but not really like not what you'd call a yeah, it's not basically constants in that. Now what you can do sometimes if you're just testing items, so say you're doing some testing, so what you can do is just create, say, a dynamic array, so just a basic dynamic array, and this might need to be a variant, and you can use array like this, so you can put values like this. So this would be useful if you're testing. Okay, so I have to make this a variant as far as I know. And so it places the value, and you can put strings in there. Now really, array is really only useful if it's only useful really for testing. It's rare in an application that you'd want to have hard-coded values. You'd normally want to read the values from somewhere. But sometimes if you're testing or if you have a small application, it just might be useful. So let me just go through the advantages then again. So the advantages of the arrays is that an array is very fast when dealing with large data. So unlike, say, we have collections and the dictionary, if we want to fill the collection, we have to basically fill it by going through each item in a loop and just filling it. So the array is super fast because we can just place the data in it, and it's fast to go through. So that's a big advantage of using arrays. And again, we assign the values and we can do it in just one line of code. And it can be used with the split function as well to parse a string very efficiently. So we can split, so if we have a delimited string, say delimited by commas, what we can do is we can parse the string using the split function, and it will actually just automatically place it into an array. So this is quite useful. So let me just give a quick example of this. So I'm going to create just a new module. So what I have here on 4 is names. So these are kind of famous names you'll recognize, and they've got kind of 3-barrel names. Now we've got, say, 8 items here. So let's just go through that sheet, and we'll just let me just call this sub names. So what we're going to do is, the I is long, and I'm just going to keep it very simple. So we'll just eat 1 to 8. We won't bother like getting the last item, just to keep it like kind of simple. And we're going to have an array as a variant. So what we do here is we use split in the range. So we're going to use sheet names, and then we use range, and we use A1. Yeah, that should be A ampersand I. We split it, and we split it by space, and we add this, we place this in an array. And then we can print out the actual array. So we can print out, just say we want to print the names in reverse, so we can print array 2, array 1, array 0. And let's bring up our immediate window and let's empty it. And so when we run our code here, you can see that it printed out all the names in reverse. So Jones, Earl, James, and Poe, Alan, Edgar. So just to show you exactly what happens, when we run this, you can see that array here. So let me get this guy closed down. So you can see that we have an array, and it actually parsed our string into this array. So this is another very useful. It's one of those things that seems quite simple, but it's actually very useful because it's not easy to parse a string that's of where the text can be different sizes. So a split is actually quite useful in this case. And we can access items directly using the index. So in other words, we can go to item 10. We don't need to read through each item. We can just go straight to the item at a particular index. So that's why the index is quite useful. Now the disadvantages is that it's difficult to change the structure. As I've said, once you create the array, it's very difficult. You can't just like take a row from it. It's quite difficult to do anything. Now changing the structure a lot, like resizing and everything, it can really slow your application down. So particularly if you've an array and every time you add a student, you decide to resize your array. So for a particular application where students are added at one at a time, an array is not a good structure to use because it's very, very slow and it requires a lot of kind of code to actually deal with resizing. And finding items is slow. So while looking up items, directly accessing items with an index is quite quick, so you can go straight to it. If you're trying to find an item, you have to read through everything in the array. So for example, if you put in a customer ID, you have to read through all the items to find a customer ID. Whereas in something like a dictionary structure, you can actually access the ID directly. So that's the disadvantage of using the arrays. So Julian, you're asking, could an array be hard-coded with values? That with value be used as a table to run a VB lookup function? No, what you do, the kind of equivalent to a lookup function is a dictionary. And just as I was saying there, so a dictionary, the way the dictionary works is that you put in a key and you put in a value. So the key is a unique value, and then you can just look up that value using the key. So I have actually a blog post written on the dictionary. So it's quite a good question because sometimes people are confused, like when would they use the dictionary and when would you use the array? So there's kind of specific times that the dictionary is actually really useful, and that would be if you had something that you wanted to do a lookup. So if I typically wanted to, if you wanted to do a fast lookup, it's actually really good to use the dictionary for it. So you can load the items into the dictionary, and then once they're in the dictionary, it's quite easy to use them. So if we go to VBA dictionary here on my website, it's my PC is slow now because of the encoding software. So let me just open this out. Yeah, the encoding software just slows it down a bit. So if you go to VBA dictionary on my blog post, so it's just excelmacromastery.com and /VBA-dictionary, and this kind of has a guide to using the dictionary, and you can just see the quick guide here, but it goes through the dictionary from start to finish with lots of examples. So if you want to know more about the dictionary, you can look here. Yeah, yeah, Julian, exactly. Yeah, it's the dictionary that I just mentioned. So Christoph, you have another question. How is the performance with arrays compared to collections and dictionaries, especially when huge data is processed? Well, yeah, I guess the difference is that, so let's take the dictionary and the array. They're kind of used for different applications. So if you wanted to read a huge amount of items into an array, because you can do it in one line, so you basically say, let's put the range into the array. So what VBA is doing, it's kind of doing a memory copy, and this is incredibly fast. Whereas if you put something into a dictionary, you have to put it in one at a time. So that's the big advantage that the array has. Now, if you're reading in memory through the array is much quicker because the array is laid out sequentially. So it's much quicker to read a for loop through it. When you're reading through a dictionary is possibly stored as a linked list or something similar underneath the hood, or maybe a hash table. So it's just a little bit slower to read through the dictionary in a sequential manner. But the kind of the speed of the dictionary is that you access the dictionary by key. So basically they're both fast in their own ways, but you typically use them for different applications. Now the collection in VBA isn't really that useful. A collection is more useful when you have an application. Say, for example, that you're in the case that you're reading through data and you just want to add certain data. So ahead of time, normally with an array, ahead of time, you know how many items you're going to have. So you'd basically say, there's 100 items in the spreadsheet, so I need 100 slots in my array. Now, collection will be typically used when you don't know in advance. So it's very easy to add and remove items. So that's when you'd use a collection. Now, because it's slower than an array because you're adding items one at a time, but if you're reading through it sequentially, it can be quite fast. So Eric, yeah, you were saying the dictionary is really nice. If you use a user-defined data type for the data component of the dictionary entry, you can do almost anything. And yeah, that's very true. And I use that all the time. So what Eric means there is that if, for example, you were reading customer data, what you can do is you can use the customer ID as the key, and then you can create a record in a class module. So the record would be like a typical record that you'd see. It would just have the customer data, like the name, address, and so on. So you would store that module in the dictionary, and then when you want to access the data, you just access it by key. So the dictionary is absolutely, it's very, very powerful. So yeah, so I hope I've explained that. So the three items, the arrays, collections, and dictionaries, they have kind of three different uses. And I know even when I started even with VBA, you have to really kind of sit back and think, like, when should you use them? Like which one is for which particular application? But generally speaking, anytime you're dealing with ranges, you're going to be using arrays. If you're just using a kind of a particular amount of items and just adding and removing a lot, then collections is better. And if you want to kind of uniquely identify items again, kind of some items or something, then a dictionary is very useful. So Mark, you were asking, can you perform arithmetic on array contents? Back on the test marks, you can get the average for each subject directly from the array. You can use the worksheet functions if that's what you mean. So let's get an example here. So let's get average. So what we'll do is we'll just do an array as a variant as normal, and if we do sheet and it's numbers, I think, and what we'll do is we'll just take the first 10 numbers. So we can pass this. So we'll just print it out. Worksheet function dot let's just do average. Now I'm not sure if this takes a two-dimensional array. That's the thing. So I guess we'll just have to try. And yeah, it actually worked. It does. Yeah, it actually worked fine with two-dimensional array. I was kind of paranoid that it wouldn't, but so this gets us actually our average of 55.22. So we can place the array. Yeah, well, it actually works because the worksheet average function takes a range as a parameter. So the array is essentially the same as the array value, or the range value is essentially the same as the array. So we can use the contents for basically any of the worksheet functions that take a range. We can just use the array. Like even if they didn't allow us, I mean, we could simply just write the value to an array and then use the array. So you can see that the array and the range are quite closely linked. So if there's any more questions, please feel free to ask. So in the meantime, just to let you know, so tomorrow I have another webinar, and the webinar is on the VBA handbook. I'll just tell you about the VBA handbook just in case you don't know about it, so the VBA handbook is just an application that I've written, and well, sorry, it's not an application. It's actually a course, and what it is it's 10. Let me just bring it across here. It's how to build 10 different VBA applications. So it's the URL is the VBA handbook. So let me just go down and just show here. So tomorrow, so it's build the total reports. It does all these different applications in VBA, shows you how to structure the applications, and it comes with step-by-step guides. So it shows you how to take the application absolutely from scratch and how to build the application into a working application. Now I cover different items, so you can see I have one that does sending a worksheet by email and so on. Now tomorrow what I'm doing is I'm running through the 6th application. So I'm going through the 6th application live, and that's at the same time as this, but tomorrow. And I'm reading from an Access database. So I'll be going through that. So this is quite useful. If you already have bought the VBA handbook, it's very useful. So you can see me going through it, and you can ask any questions if you have any about the different parts of the application. Now, if you don't have the VBA application, maybe you just want to see me building an entire application in VBA just to see how it would be approached. And so again, it's free. This is on tomorrow and it's free. And you'll just see the link on my YouTube channel. So Eric, you're asking, how about a dynamic multi-dimensional array? Yes, so a dynamic multi-array. So let's create a sub. So dynamic multi. So I haven't done this in a while, so bear with me. So array, we create the array as we'll create the array as long, and then we're going to do redim array, and what we do, just the same 1 2 3 and 1 2 5, say for example, and we'll just run it then just to see what it looks like. And so there you can see it's got the different parts to it. So basically, it's basically similar to how you just create a dynamic one. So like with a dynamic one, a normal dynamic one, you just do a normal dynamic one like this. So it's basically the same, except when in your redim statement you specify the dimensions. So when we say array here, we're basically saying we're going to create an array in the future. But we're basically not even saying to VBA that it's going to be a dynamic array, or sorry, that it's not going to be what dimensions it has. We're basically saying we're going to just create a array in the future. So I hope that makes sense, Eric. So yeah, so and I was saying there that yeah, so tomorrow I'm going through, so this is going to be a live workshop where I build the Access database from scratch. And so it's quite a useful application, because anytime you're using Excel VBA, there's going to be like a database somewhere close by. So normally you're going to be reading from a database, or maybe the files you have will end up in a database. So in this case, we read the data from Access and we write it to an Excel worksheet, and then vice versa, we update the worksheet from Excel, or we update the database table from Excel. So it's quite a useful application. But even if you're not as advanced, I cover like how the different parts of building an application, how you structure it, so that you kind of just don't end up with a big mess of code, and how to make your code kind of more bulletproof. So how to avoid having kind of constant, having lots of errors in your code. So we write kind of code. When you're kind of a professional coder, what you want to do is kind of have neat, easily readable code, and you want to write code that will be pretty bulletproof. You don't want your code to keep breaking because you're going to spend a lot of time fixing it. So I'll just show you kind of a lot of tips and kind of secrets that professionals use to kind of write really nice, structured, readable code. Yeah, no problem, Eric. Yeah, glad that you like it. So like, as I was saying, if you want to recap on any of this stuff, because obviously you're not going to remember everything off the top of your head. If you just go to my let me just see the VBA array, and this will just bring you to the actual array webpage. So I'm just VBA arrays, I think I have it called. We just go. Yeah, my computer is just very slow at the moment because I'm using an encoder when I run this webinar, so it just slows down everything. So if you just go to this article, so Excel VBA array. If you Google actually VBA arrays, this article, depending on where you are, but this article will appear at the top of Google pretty much. So VBA arrays, and if you go down here, it just shows you how it compares dynamic to static, and it just shows you how to declare them and how to set the size and so on. And so if you want a quick guide to get back to the arrays, it's actually quite useful. So how can a dynamic, so Eric, you're asking, how can, so this is a different Eric actually, Pierce. So how can a dynamic array be sorted? For example, the array with James R. Jones and other names, how can that be sorted and listed by, say, the last name? Well, basically, there isn't an easy way to do it. There's no sort function in VBA. So basically, what you have to do is kind of get a sort function. Now, one way you can do it, if you didn't have a lot of stuff, like say your data wasn't long, what you could do is if you write out the data to a range, you can sort the range. But if you have a lot of data, it's quite slow. So typically what you'd use is kind of a sort function. Now, I don't have one. Do I have one in the array? And that might be something that would be worth adding to the array. But if I look at collections, so here's a blog post I have on collections. Now I'm sure I have a sort in this. So let me just bring this across. Yeah, so the collection, so the collection is the same. The collection doesn't have an actual sort in it. So what we have to do is write our own sort. So typically this is a sort function. Now you might think this sort function looks complicated, and if you're new to programming, it probably is. But the thing about it is that you can just take the quick sort function and just use it. You don't need to rewrite this code or anything. You can just copy this code and use it. So for the array, we typically use a similar quick sort function. So I don't actually that's something I might update the arrays article with, is a sort, because yeah, it's typically something that's important. Now you're asking, of course, about a two-dimensional array. So you'd have to adjust the sort to sort on the particular number. So one of the parameters of that sort function would have to have the column, so that you would say, okay, let's sort it on maybe the third column or sort it on the fourth column. And so essentially that would be how you do it. Now, if you're good enough at coding, I mean, you can take this quicksort function and just like replace the collection with the array. I mean, the sorting will be exactly the same. It's just the array part that will change. So I hope that answers your question, Eric. But yeah, it's a frustrating thing when you start in VBA that there isn't really sort functions for anything. And like if you're in a language like C# and you take the array lists, like you can actually sort. The array list comes with a sort, and all the structures, you just basically select the sort property and it sorts your array. So it's kind of a source of frustration when you start into VBA. Yeah, no problem at all, Eric. So if there's any further questions, please go ahead. So I'll probably end in about like 5 minutes or so. So if there's further questions or anything you want to know, please go ahead and ask. Now also, let me just hide this one down. Now also, if there's questions you have that you think of after, or they're just a bit more complicated, like feel free to just email me the questions. And my email address, it's paul@excelmacromastery.com. So yeah, glad you liked it, Mark. Glad that it's been very helpful. Yeah, no problem at all, Eric. Glad that you liked the presentation. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Christoph. You're welcome. I'm going to pronounce it wrong. Masek, I think your name is. I'm going to pronounce it wrong because it's been ages since I've pronounced it. But I'm glad that you liked it, and it's great to have you on again. Yeah, you're always at my presentation, so it's great that you're finding some use from them. So Timothy, you're asking, where can we order the example book that I wrote? Is it available in bookstores? And if so, what's the ordering number? So what do you mean by the I'm not sure what you mean by the example book. I have a book in, let me see. Yeah. You're welcome, Gabor. Glad that you enjoyed it. VBA. Let me just see that book. I do have a book in Amazon, and so this is kind of like a guide to VBA. So let me just find it here on Amazon. Oh, here we go. Yeah, the book is called Excel Macro Mastery, just like the website. Let me just give you the link. So here's the link. I'll just paste the link. So this is the link here, Timothy. And so this is Amazon book. So that's the link, which let me just check and make sure that it actually links properly. And that seems to work. So let me just post in that. So the VBA handbook. So if you want to come tomorrow, and yeah, so the VBA handbook, if you just want to see the website, so the VBA handbook, it's just here. Yeah, so that's just the link. Yeah, sorry. So that's just the link there, the Excel VBA handbook .com. So you can just look at that page there. So the handbook is actually it's 10 different books which are a guide to building the applications, and it comes with all the code. So all the details are on this actual web page. And then there's a second one that I sell that comes with the 10 videos. So there's video workshops that comes with it as well. So tomorrow I'm going to be working on the 6th application there. So yeah, if you go and have a look at that web page, it kind of gives you all the details. And if you've got any questions, you can just fill in the questionnaire, or just email me at paul@excelmacromastery.com. So I hope that answers your questions, Timothy. And Wes, glad that you liked it as well. Glad that you enjoyed it very much. So so I'm going to leave it there. So thanks to everybody for turning up tonight. I hope you enjoyed and found it useful. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the replay up for 24 hours. So it's going to be at the same link. So you can just get it at the same link for the next 24 hours. And after that, then I'm going to put it into the premium section on the site. So I've just started a premium section on the site, but it's only kind of going through just the basics at the moment. So I'll kind of send more details about this around in an email, in future emails on my email list. Okay, so have a good night, and I hope to see you all tomorrow.